Well, good afternoon and to some, good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining British American Business today for our business briefing, a special deal for a special relationship, where we will be taking an expert look into what is actually going to happen with a UK-US trade agreement. We are pleased to welcome you all from across the UK, US, and EU for BAB's inaugural online programming. So, before we kick off with opening remarks and panelist introductions, I want to do some quick digital housekeeping rules for everyone. We have muted all participants to avoid any background noise, but we absolutely do want to have participants be involved and have this be as interactive as possible. Ironically, it's likely to be even more interactive than if we were running this in person. So if you have any questions as the discussion goes on, please submit them using the question and answer feature within Zoom. We will put these to the panelists as the discussion is taking place, and also keep aside 15 minutes at the end for questions as well. If you would like a specific panelist to answer your question, please include that in the question that you submit. Also, if you have to leave at any point, don't worry about missing anything. A recording of the session will be made available for all those who got confirmation to attend for 24 hours after the session finishes. Now, with that, before I introduce and bring in our all-star panel, I'm going to hand over to Emmanuel Adam, BAB's Executive Director here in London. Emmanuel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Theo. Good day and good afternoon to everyone on both sides of the Atlantic. There would be no other trade organization as appropriate as British American Business to offer a webinar on today's topic. We have been created to represent the transatlantic corridor. Our mission is to strengthen this unique relationship, and we champion all those who are part of that relationship. In this context, let me, on behalf of our CEO, Duncan Edwards, our entire team, and also our colleagues across the wider BAB network in the UK and the US, say a big thanks to the many transatlantic companies who really do everything they can to help us fight the crisis these days. I also want to thank the over 150 participants today, corporate partners and friends from the wider BAB network for having joined us today for the webinar. Your interest is a testament to the work that we are so proud to do on behalf of our members and the wider community. This is why I would like to end my remarks with the following. BAB's leitmotif these days is standing with you. We are committed more than ever to support and work on behalf of you and our wider community. This includes that we help you understand the current landscape, find support, showcase your services, but also keeping the momentum going for a stronger economic relationship between the UK and the US. It is thanks to our members, every single company, every single person, that we can do the work that we do. If you're not yet part of our community, please get in touch. I really look forward to this discussion. Back over to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel, and hello again, everyone. Now, as Emmanuel alluded to, there is an obvious elephant in the room, which is that we are in the middle of an unprecedented moment for all of us, both professionally and personally. And that sets up perfectly for part of the discussion we'll be having today. As many of you will know, negotiations between the UK and the US were due to have kicked off at the end of March in Washington, DC, which of course has not happened. Now, for those of us who operate in the transatlantic trade and investment environment, there are a number of questions about how this will impact a negotiation which already had challenges in the path ahead. Therefore, today, we're going to be examining just what really is going to happen with the UK-US negotiation, whenever that can take place, and what we anticipate seeing from both sides, and what the domestic and external dynamics will be taking place and impacting that. Our discussion will be split into three themes. Firstly, the negotiating process and the role of institutions. Secondly, and importantly, the personalities and the relationships that will go into a negotiation. And finally, examining what the barriers will be to negotiating and the scope of what will be possible. So with that, I am delighted to introduce our panelists. of legitimate experts from across the UK and the US and get the discussion started. Firstly, Marianne Petzinger, Senior Research Fellow, US and the Americas at Chatham House and self-confessed trade wonk. Alongside Marianne is Lou Lukins, former Deputy Chief of Mission to the US Embassy, now serving as a senior partner with Signum Global Advisors in London, an advisory firm covering policy and markets. And I'm also happy to welcome from the United States two equally distinguished colleagues, Barbara Weisel and Cleet Williams. Barbara has more than 25 years of experience advancing international trade and investment initiatives, both in the private sector and within government. Barbara most recently served as Assistant US Trade Representative, where she was Chief Negotiator for the 12-country Trans-Pacific Partnership. She is now Managing Director at the famed international advisory firm Rock Creek Advisors in DC. And finally, I am delighted to welcome Cleet Williams, the former Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economics, Deputy Director of the National Economic Council, and Trade Negotiator for the White House. Cleet led US negotiations at multilateral summits and was Chief Counsel at USTR, and now serves as a partner at Akin Gump in Washington, DC. Welcome to you all. Feel free to take yourself off mute and we will begin. So what I'm going to do is start with you, Barbara, and then go on to you, Cleet, which is to get a sort of behind the curtains understanding of how trade negotiations actually work. Barbara, the UK and the US have put out their negotiating objectives. Can you take us behind the curtain on how USTR will have come up with their objectives and who will have had the most influence in producing them?
Thanks, Theo, and thanks for having me today. I wanted to make us feel that we were getting close to the negotiations. So the building behind me is actually USTR. And even though the negotiators won't be getting together in person for some time, at least they'll feel like they're closer to getting together in person. So that's the building behind me. In terms of the negotiating objectives themselves, I think that the objectives that you see put out by the United States are fairly general, and they are very consistent with the objectives that you've seen from previous comprehensive negotiations. Those objectives are drawn from Trade Promotion Authority, the statute that details how trade negotiations are to proceed, what needs to be achieved in those negotiations, and the process for achieving it. The Trade Promotion Authority statute has been updated over time, but it is very detailed. And so the objectives themselves really just reflect what's in Trade Promotion Authority. Congress and the administration and stakeholders work together on that legislation, and then that's reflected in the objectives. The objectives themselves, as I said, are very general in reflecting Trade Promotion Authority, and as to the details of what will actually be concluded in the negotiations, those go beyond some of what you'll see in the general objectives.
Thank you. That leads us on to a very pertinent point, which is around the, as you said, the TPA. And Cleet, I wanted to bring you in on that. The TPA is, of course, due to be renegotiated in July 2021. Can you just walk us through some scenarios? If we've already started negotiating, which we may be able to do officially in the fall, does the renegotiation of TPA cause a major hurdle for a negotiation to get through when it comes around?
Let me first take the opportunity to say it's great to be here with all of you. My background is some of the art for my children, not quite as impressive as Barbara's, but hopefully that will still make do. And I just want to comment quickly on the point that Barbara made, and maybe just tie it to this administration a little bit. And that's that in general, I agree with her completely in the sense that you have the administration, Congress, and stakeholders that influence the negotiating objectives and then the text that is eventually tabled. What I think is a little bit unique about this administration, and that may be relevant to these negotiations, is I think you see a stronger hand from USTR itself as compared with other players in the U.S. interagency, as compared with Congress and even with outside groups than you may ordinarily see. You have a very strong USTR at the moment who's very close to the president, and I think that will dictate some of how these negotiations evolve. Now, in terms of how TPA plays into this, these negotiations have been launched under the existing TPA, and I think the way that most people are thinking about this is that we need to hit the benchmarks that have been established in that legislation, and that we need to do so before the legislation expires. And that is, next July 1, we have run out of TPA authority. And so there's a lot of pressure for us to try to conclude that agreement under this authority so that things don't get difficult beyond that. Now, your question sort of refers to, what happens if we don't make that and we have to operate under a new TPA authority. And I mean, and that is a universe that's very difficult to predict. I would say for all intents and purposes, we'll see how coronavirus affects this. We'll see how everything else affects this. But the US is clearly trying to complete these negotiations under existing TPA, so it doesn't have to deal with that complexity that you're talking about. My understanding is that the UK is trying to do so as well. One last comment, though, just on your point, is if we get into this area where TPA is renegotiated, what are we going to see? I think that there will be a lot of a desire for changes. I do think that there is some relative frustration on the part of our Congress right now that they haven't been consulted with as much as they would like. And I would expect that Congress tries to strengthen its hand in any subsequent negotiation of TPA. On the administration side, I think you'll see the opposite, which is that the administration wants more flexibility. It doesn't want to be tied into necessarily comprehensive negotiations for all trading partners. And that doesn't apply necessarily to the UK, where I think we were trending towards comprehensive, but it is a general view from this administration.
Thank you. That was very informative. Barbara, I just wanted to do one quick follow-up with you around TPA. What's it like being in USTR when Congress is negotiating the mandate for TPA? Are you given opportunities for input, or is it very much up to Congress to determine what that looks like?
Well, I think, as Clee pointed out here, the history of what it has been like in the past may be irrelevant to the next renegotiation of TPA. In the past, there has been very much a give and take. Congress really does have strong views, and traditionally, the two different parties have strong views, and it's a push-pull between the parties as well as with participation by the administration. I think in this current or the next upcoming renegotiation of TPA, you may have a more united view from members of Congress about the role that they intend to play or the input that they think that they should be having on TPA. I mean, I think it's important to recall that TPA is based on the US Constitution, which gives Congress authority on trade and tariffs. And so when TPA delegates that authority to the administration under certain conditions, that's what TPA is all about. So when Congress comes back to reconsider a new trade promotion authority, it will be based on the fact that they have delegated that authority only under certain conditions, and they want to control that. So I think in this next iteration, it could be a bit more complicated. And it's already usually complicated. I think it'll be more so this time.
That's funny. I heard Congress was always so straightforward to deal with.
Always.
Okay, so thank you to you both. What we're going to do is turn now to some of the interpersonal relationships and dynamics which will likely impact negotiation, especially when it comes to one between the UK and the US. And Lou, I wanted to bring you in to examine the unique aspects of a UK-US trade negotiation. The UK-US relationship is often cited as being the strongest of any two nations, and based upon its trade and investment relationship, it is. Sometimes the relationship is even described as special. But how does the relationship between two countries actually play into the dynamics and progress of a negotiation? Does it matter if it's a special relationship?
Thanks, Theo, and thanks for having me on today. Look, I think that the special relationship does matter and it does count. And I think it matters in the sense that it makes it easier for the two negotiating sides to meet and to talk to each other. So the US negotiating team, the British negotiating team have a pretty good sense. They're speaking the same language, and I don't mean just English, but they're speaking the same language when they're talking about trade. They understand what they're saying and what they're talking about. So in that sense, the close relationship between the bureaucracies in our two countries works to both countries' advantage when it comes to a negotiation. And then at the leadership level, I think it also helps that Boris Johnson and the president seem to have a close relationship, and they have both sent strong signals from their offices that they want to see this deal done and they want to see it happen. So I think the combination of the real professionalism of the negotiating teams on both sides, the fact that they have known each other for a long time and have worked together and have been talking on these issues for a while, plus the leadership that comes from the top, come to an agreement, I think bodes well for
Okay, we might
negotiate.
Yeah. Okay, what we're going to do is switch to Marianne for just a second. Marianne, as Lou alluded to there, the UK and US have a very close bond, especially when it comes to between the two leaders, which is helping drive this forward. But of course, this relationship doesn't take place this negotiation will not take place within a vacuum. For the UK-US trade agreement negotiation to take place, we're also going to be doing that alongside the UK and US both negotiating with the European Union, true transatlantic triangle. Now, how will tensions between any of these three affect its negotiations with each other? Does it matter? And what are you looking for as these two parallel negotiations take place to suggest that progress can be made?
I think it's absolutely critical to not see those negotiations as being conducted in silos, because as you rightly pointed out, we have those parallel negotiations going on. And critically important for the UK-US negotiations is ultimately also what the future relationship between the UK and the EU will look like, because trade negotiations are less about tariffs, they're increasingly about rules, regulations, standards. So the extent to which the UK continues to be aligned with the EU will really shape the ability to strike a free trade agreement with the United States. So that's, I think, the critical point. And then to that extent, there might also be, the looming battles of the TTIP negotiations that resurface. And to some extent, we have seen that again already, whether it's with regards to concerns about chlorinated chicken, or with regards to GM food or hormone-fed beef. The second point I want to make is that, ironically, the UK published its negotiating mandate for negotiations with the US on the same day, 2nd of March, where official negotiations with the EU commenced. And I think that was quite symbolic and important. But there's really, stark differences, both in terms of the form, but also the substance, if you look at the negotiation objectives. So for one instance, for example, with the negotiations with the EU, it's really about a level playing field and concerns about, environment and labor and subsidies that are critical there. And the UK has made it very clear that even though with the EU it wants to have a deal, it's willing to potentially, walk away. Whereas with the US, I think the UK or both sides have a very strong political interest to come to a deal, and this threat of just walking away hasn't been made. And again, that is part of the special relationship that Lou just talked about. However, at the same time, it's important to compare the negotiation objectives that the US put out. So, they're quite similar actually. So the US's negotiation objectives with the ones for the UK and with the ones for the EU are strikingly similar. So to that extent, I really don't see the kind of special relationship translating into a special deal when it comes to the substance of the matters. And also, if you're looking at this triangular relationship, many of the concerns that we're kind of seeing overshadow trade negotiations, for example, are having to do with the US's imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminum, for example, that hit both the EU but also the UK and others for the time being. So again, it's not just the negotiations in silos, but the larger framework of trade and the move towards protectionism that we're seeing, and the global pandemic will not make that any easier, I'm afraid.
No, you're right, it doesn't. And one other factor which is going to play into this is, of course, the United States is due to have a election in November this year. And Lou, you were touching on the closeness of the current president and our prime minister and how that could make negotiations run smoother. If we were to see a change in presidency from a Republican president to a Democrat president, would you expect a different approach to trade between the US and the United Kingdom?
I think, look, if Joe Biden wins in November, I think the trade negotiations would likely be put on the back burner for a while. I think it would slow down the process. I think the Democratic Party in general has slightly different negotiating objectives than the Republicans would have. So there might be some tweaks to the negotiating points. But I think a Democratic president would be just as keen, I think, to have a trade agreement with the United Kingdom as a Republican president is right now.
Well, it's very reassuring to hear. Whatever happens, then we can still be making progress. Barbara, I wanted to bring you in on what can happen with a trade negotiation, when we aren't able to meet in person. We're all currently learning how to turn our businesses and many aspects of our personal lives online. Now, is a trade negotiation something that can be done over Zoom or whichever platform you want to pick? Or do negotiations rely on that in-person meetings to make breakthroughs? And could this be a chance to try and innovate the trade negotiation process?
The short answer is no, it's not really a chance to innovate. I don't believe. I think that the trade negotiations will necessarily be slowed down by the inability to meet face-to-face, which could have an impact on Cleet's point about trying to finish the negotiations before TPA expires, assuming nobody decides to just extend it for purposes of this negotiation. I think the negotiations very much do depend on personal relationships and building up trust between negotiators. It is possible to exchange negotiating proposals via Zoom and explain each side's positions and maybe to begin a negotiation on some of the less sensitive issues. But as soon as you get to the choreography of a negotiation that is keeping issues moving along in different negotiating chapters simultaneously, and when you get to some of the even medium sensitive issues, it becomes very difficult to do that by video conference. The reason is this: when you're doing a video conference like this, you have no idea who else is in the room, and you can't float proposals for solutions that are best done between trusted colleagues off in the corner. You can pick up the phone and call, but you don't know who else is listening. So I think people are very much reluctant to begin trying to think through solutions that require people to be together, kind of working out solutions without lots of other people listening and trying to tear down the ideas from behind the scenes. So I think it is going to be a very serious challenge. I know these teams know each other well from the work that they've done already over the past year. So they've built up good relationships, and that will help. I'm sure they can do phone calls on the side, but I think not being able to work face-to-face is going to be a huge challenge.
Yeah, that you touched upon something about what's possible to be done when we're not able to meet. and how it's unlikely that anything, of course, could be agreed without these taking place in person. Clete, I wanted to ask you about the scope of an agreement and what might be possible.
Yeah.
Now, in your experience, having negotiated in multiple forums and on multiple negotiations, we've seen the US most recently doing deals with China and Japan with phase one agreements. Considering the complexities of what's possible at the moment between the UK and US, do you think there's an option to consider a phase one agreement between the UK and the US as a way to demonstrate progress?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of great material here. I want to answer your question. There's a couple of things I want to comment on. First of all, let me say unequivocally, from the US position at this time, they do not want to do phases. They believe that the best way to move forward with the UK is a comprehensive deal. I think some of the challenges that we had with China and Japan don't exist here. With China, I mean, there was just the politics of it were incredibly difficult. Nationalistic sentiment rising on both sides. And so at the end of the day, it was just the art of what is possible here. And I don't expect that you'll have that kind of contentiousness here with the US and UK. With Japan, of course, and Barbara knows this incredibly well, Japan wanted the US to be in TPP, so they didn't want to do a comprehensive agreement with the United States. So again, that was what we were able to achieve, and that's why we did the phased approach. So I don't see that dynamic here. I do want to comment, if you'll allow me, on a couple of things that others said. I think Barbara, I agree with her 100%, but I want to share what I thought was an incredibly helpful paradigm. I was talking to one of the US negotiators the other day, and he described it in this way. And he said, look, there are three phases in a negotiation. There is phase one, where you get to know each other, you get to understand each other's systems, you get to scope what are you going to cover in the negotiation. There's phase two, where you start to table text, you start to understand what that text means. And then there's phase three, where you get to the really difficult trade-offs. And phase one, a lot of that we've already done. We've been able to do that before we launched the official negotiations. Phase two, we're doing now, and we believe that we can continue to do through digital video conferences and things like that. But phase three is what is just really impossible in this climate, and they need to get together face to face for all the reasons Barbara described. And I just thought that was a very helpful paradigm to share. The last point I want to touch on quickly is the special relationship. And, I've been in meetings with the president, with Prime Minister May, as well as Prime Minister Johnson. And, it is true what you hear, the chemistry between the UK's current Prime Minister and the president is very good. I think they do see each other as kindred spirits. I think that the president was a little bit frustrated with Prime Minister May, to be blunt about it. Felt like the kind of withdrawal agreement that she was negotiating with the EU wouldn't have given the UK enough flexibility, that they would have been part of the customs union. They wouldn't have been able to do the kind of FTA that we wanted them to do. And he told basically Prime Minister Johnson, you got to use more leverage, give yourself flexibility. And that's what he did. And so I think the US looks at this evolution as very positive. I will say, though, just to push back a little bit on a point that Marianne made, which is I know that a lot of folks in the UK think of this as, well, we got to see what we get with the EU so we know what we can get with the US. But I think the US looks at it as that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. If the UK truly is going to do a Canadian style agreement with the EU, that doesn't really preclude them from doing whatever they want with the US. And I think that's the viewpoint from over here.
Marianne, I'm going to bring you in to respond to that. Do you think the UK negotiating with the EU does preclude anything being done with the US, especially with the view that the UK may or may not have to extend the timeline for negotiation if it's unable to start with the EU as well?
And again, in some areas that might be much more easily done than with others, particularly the contentious issues that have been long-standing. I think there you really need to have a better understanding of that future relationship between the United Kingdom and the EU. The other issue, and we've alluded to it already, is the issue of timing and this whole question around extending the transition period. So far, the UK government has ruled that out. So essentially, the transition period, comes to an end at the end of this year, but there are increasing voices and also public attitude that is shifting towards, give ourselves more time. And then again, that would potentially have implications to really make meaningful progress on the UK-US trade negotiations. But at the same time, again, the critical point is that the terms of a US-UK free trade agreement cannot come into effect until the transition period is officially over. So just to keep that in mind. And then there again are other logistical questions around the timing where, if COVID-19 pushes back the negotiation schedule, how does that then interplay with TPA? How does that interplay with the US election? And so a number of issues that just make the already complex negotiations even more difficult. And also I think, issues around COVID-19 on the substance, for example, there's already, I think, big question mark to what extent US demands on food and agriculture, for example, were contentious on this side. But I think with COVID-19, there's also been an increased focus again on food security, for example. So I think there is also on the substantive side, more questions than answers for the time being.
That's a great question, a great point you raise. And Lou, I want to bring you in here. And you have a vast experience dealing with countries from all over the world. When this crisis is over, is there a risk that the reputation of international trade itself is further tarnished around the world and countries will seek real self-sufficiency in things like medicines, food, and other sectors? Could this potentially engender yet more protectionism?
I think we're already seeing a move and lots of talk about countries having greater control over their supply chains and being able to manufacture more essential equipment and medicines at home. I don't think that necessarily would negatively affect a potential US-UK trade agreement. I think, again, our countries are so well aligned in many ways and we have a great understanding of each other that I think what would even be more likely is a possibility of sort of a transatlantic zone where we can trust each other as trusted partners, and the US would manufacture items in the UK and vice versa. So I think we are looking at changes in the way that countries consider supply chains and things like that in a post-COVID world. But I don't think that's necessarily a negative for a possible US-UK trade agreement.
Thanks very much. Barbara, I wanted to ask you, and this is a question which is coming from our Q&A, and thank you everyone who is submitting questions into that. The UK obviously has a devolved system of government. How does the US take into account the views of devolved assemblies and parliaments during the negotiations? Will it have individual outreaches to those devolved assemblies in the UK, do you expect?
I'm sorry, will it have?
How does the US deal with devolved government when it's negotiating with a country? Will it have dedicated outreach to those devolved assemblies like we have in the UK?
Dedicated outreach in the US?
Will the US have dedicated outreach to the devolved assemblies in the UK, considering the nature of our government being both our central government and our devolved assemblies in the regions?
I mean, I think the US tends to try to reach out to as many officials as possible. I mean, the negotiation is with the government itself, the central government, and that authority remains. But it's important to understand the views of as many players as possible so that you can understand where the opposition is going to come from and whose voices are likely to play a role as the more difficult issues are raised in the negotiations. So I will assume that COVID-19 aside, and that there isn't some ability to do that the negotiators will try to do that. I did want to just make a point going back to the special relationship, if I could. I agree that the special relationship is helpful in this negotiation, but as a negotiator, I want to just remind people of the point that when two countries are negotiating a trade deal, no matter how close they are going to work as hard as they can to achieve their objectives, regardless of that relationship. So you may have less contention than what you had, for instance, in US-China negotiations, But even when two countries are working that have particularly close political ties, or even maybe fewer bilateral issues between them than in other situations, there's always difficult issues between them. And I think here, as has been stated, there are a lot of very, very challenging issues, not only between us, but because of the negotiations with the EU and the UK. You know, the trilateral nature of this will make this very, very complicated, regardless of the close relationship.
Yes, you make a very good point on that. And the final point you made regarding the EU as well. Marianne, we've had a question, if you can just go back to what would be possible in an extended transition in terms of the UK negotiating with the United States, if it's still in a transition period with the EU. Are you able to just go back over how that would impact the UK's ability to negotiate with the US, and if there are restrictions on that?
Well, again, in terms of actual negotiations taking place, that is totally doable because the UK has officially left the EU. It's just a question of to what extent any terms of a future agreement can come into effect. And so during the transition period, that is not possible. However, you know, if the transition period ends as planned at the end of the year, then if there is an agreement in the interim, that could take effect. If the transition period gets extended, that also means a future agreement, you know, cannot enter into effect until the transition period is officially ended. And then the question is, you know, in the current environment, will the UK government shift its position and actually ask for the transition period to be extended? A decision would have to be made by June, so we will, you know, in the coming months get more clarity. But as of today, the UK is not interested in extending the transition period.
Well, that'll be very interesting to see what happens with that for all of us. Clete, I wanted to ask you about, again, what is possible. You mentioned earlier on, to recap, you mentioned that we would be looking for a comprehensive trade agreement from the United States with the UK. But we have heard language about some quick wins or smaller sector deals taking place within and outside of a trade agreement. In your experience, is there much appetite for that from within USTR when it comes to negotiating?
So when it comes to negotiating in general, the answer is yes. And you've clearly seen that in a lot of different contexts. I mean, clearly you saw it with Japan, you saw it with China. You're hearing it being discussed, and it's what they're pursuing with the EU. I mean, the view with the EU is we can't do comprehensive right now for a variety of reasons, and therefore let's try to get what we're calling an early harvest to build some momentum, to build some goodwill. Now, with the UK, though, that isn't the approach. My old boss, Ambassador Bolton, floated that idea when he was in London about a year ago, but I will tell you, and confidentially, you know, USTR wasn't pleased. That isn't the direction that they want to go. They don't see the UK as having some of the same challenges that I've mentioned with Japan or the EU or China, and so they really think a comprehensive is doable here, and that's what they want to do. So I really don't see them moving in that direction unless somehow we get into this scenario where a bunch of other external events happen and we're just trying to harvest whatever we want. I mean, the president does like quick wins. We all know that. But again, the commentary in the US, around the UK, other than that stray visit, has been comprehensive.
Thanks so much, Clete. And I know that some of the people who are online today worked as part of that John Bolton visit, and they'll be looking back fondly upon that. What I'm going to do now is turn to some of the audience Q&A we've had coming in, and thank you again, everyone, for submitting your questions. I encourage you to submit more as we go on. We have about 15 minutes more. But Barbara, I wanted to direct this question to you, which is a lot of the friction in the US with negotiating with the US seems to be because of the patchwork of regulations at a state level rather than at a federal level. Is this just a fact of life, or is there an opportunity to strike a deal at the federal level that overcomes state level regulations?
I don't think that the state level regulation has actually proven to be a complication in our negotiations in the past. The US has dealt with this issue for a long time now and has negotiating proposals that address any differences between the state and the federal government. The only area where it has continued to be a little bit of a challenge is on government procurement, where the US federal government needs to get the explicit approval of states in order to include state procurement in the agreement. And many states have become somewhat reluctant to be included in the procurement provisions. But in terms of just the regulatory side generally, I think that that has proven to be less of an issue than sometimes people assume it is.
Okay, thank you very much for tackling that one. We're going to switch now to a question we've just had come in. Marianne, I'm going to give this one for you to crack because Marianne wrote last year a very good paper on transatlantic trade in the era of Trump. And so, Marianne, the question is, what would be the key divergences between a hypothetical future UK-US agreement and current arrangements between the US and EU?
So I think, again, those negotiations are going on in parallel, but I think, there are certain objectives that the UK certainly has and is pushing for that are outside of, what the EU, for example, is prioritizing. And in particular, I think the focus on services and financial services is quite critical for the negotiations between the UK and the United States, and perhaps less so for those between the EU and the United States, even though some member states have an interest in it as well. But I think particularly for the UK-US relationship, that one is quite critical. Other issues, and again, it has perhaps more to do with public perceptions also, are questions around NHS and the drug pricing issue. And here, if you take a look at the UK's negotiating objectives, on page 1, they very clearly say that that is not on the negotiation table. So I think that, again, is one of the lessons learned of the TTIP negotiations were in the UK even back then. That was one of the key, concerns. And I guess to me, it also suggests that even if it's not on the negotiation table, if the public perceives that issue to still be part of the negotiations, then any future UK-US deal is going to struggle for legitimacy. And so that really, I think, also raises the question of stakeholder engagement, legitimacy, and I think there are important lessons, have to be learned.
Yes, thank you, Marianne. That brings us very neatly, which we always like, to a secondary question which was raised. And Lou, I want to direct this one to you. You are now living in the UK, in part here because you love our food. But we have a question about perception of negotiating with the US. As you will know, living in the UK, the current COVID-19 has thrown up into light the importance, practically and in the hearts of the British public. Do you think there is still a job that needs to be done to win over the British public to negotiating a trade agreement with the United States?
Look, my sense is that the British public is very enthusiastic about a trade agreement. There are obviously issues that are sticking points, and the ones that we read about in papers all the time: chlorinated chicken, GMO beef, phytosanitary standards, things like that, that the British people feel very passionately about, and as well as the NHS and drug prices. So these will be issues which the negotiators will have to hammer out. But in general, I find great enthusiasm here for the idea of a US-UK trade agreement, as there should be, because I think it can benefit both of the countries.
Thanks very much, Lou. Khalid, we'll go to you. Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on this because I think it's a really critical point, and I think it's really critical for the audience today, especially those in the UK business community. And that's that I think we spend all this time talking about chlorinated chicken and NHS, and that seems to consume a lot of the press coverage of this negotiation. And I think it's really important that the business community in the UK actively talk about their offensive interests with the United States, because there are a lot of them. And even in the agricultural sector, that's one area where the US may have to do some difficult things. There's a lot of mutually beneficial stuff, I think, on financial services, on digital trade, on issues like that. And it's really important that the coverage of this doesn't just focus on the negative, that it focuses on the positive. And I think that's a little bit of the problem we saw with TTIP, was that the negative headlines just consumed everything and people forgot all the great stuff that was going to happen here. And I think it's important that we change the narrative a little bit and the business community be more vocal about these things, because you know what? It's not just the UK who may have to do a couple difficult things to get this great agreement. It's also the US. So we need to change that conversation. And then just one point on the NHS, because I can't help myself, which is, look, no one's trying to privatize the NHS. And, when it comes to drug pricing, this stuff is super controversial in the United States too. And we are having a strong political debate about that issue. And, the things that we try to do in these trade agreements is not as, game-changing, earth-shattering as it may seem. It's just, hey, let's get a little more transparency into the system and make sure that when these bids go out, people understand what the rules of the game are and can compete fairly. And again, I think framing it in that way, hopefully we focus on the positive more than the negative. And then on the negative, we talk about it in a way that's realistic instead of fear-mongering.
Marianne, you wanted to come in?
Well, just also to add that, when we talk about the benefits of having these negotiations, it shouldn't just be about potential economic benefits. And the UK, has released its kind of estimates of that in the long term, a trade agreement with the United States could increase UK GDP by, I think, 0.16% in the long term. So not huge, positive, yes, but, modest. But I think it's also important to kind of see those negotiations as part of, the larger engagement on trade. And there is an opportunity here also for the UK to engage with the US on reforming the World Trade Organization, for example, or tackling common concerns vis-a-vis China. So I think it would be a huge missed opportunity if it's really just about the bilateral US-UK trade relationship and not, again, broadening it out to other really, strategic issues where the UK and the US have joint concerns and joint interests.
That's a really valuable point. Clete, I wanted to come back to you. You mentioned about the business community. Obviously, British American Business is a transatlantic business association. What helpful input can the business community actually give to USTR to help it make the case for the UK-US trade agreement?
Well, it's a lot of what I'm saying. I think the British business community, number one, just being more vocal about what they want to achieve, and then trying to partner, with U.S. companies and come up with mutually agreeable solutions that work for both sides, that can then be presented to our governments. Just try to give some momentum to the negotiators by facilitating solutions that work for both business communities, so that we can all agree to it. I just think that's helpful. But again, my biggest point is I'm just worried about the narrative focusing on the negative. And I love what Marianne said as well. This isn't just about bilateral. And even the stuff that's ostensibly bilateral is also broader. And I look at financial services, where one of the objectives here is not only to facilitate trade between us, but to recognize we both have gold standard financial services sectors. Let's create a model for the world that allows both of us to thrive and create high standards everywhere. And I think, the US is also really excited that the UK is going to be sort of independent in the WTO and hopefully can be a helpful actor as we push towards the necessary reform of that organization. And I love to hear, let's work together on China. I know that's an issue where, quite frankly, the US is a little worried about how forceful the UK will be on helping us out on China. But I do hope that there's an opportunity there.
Thanks, Clete. I'm going to stick with you because we've had a question here which complements your background very nicely, and it's on the WTO. So the question is, how likely is it that some of the WTO-based trade disputes can be resolved between the UK and US in order to build up some trust and keep momentum going for a UK-US trade agreement?
So I'm hearing that there is some momentum right now on the Airbus and Boeing dispute. A lot of the energy in the US-EU negotiations has been on that. The fact is that the retaliation that's come into place, I know folks don't like it. They don't like to pay tariffs. We don't like to impose them, but it has created some momentum. There's also been some changes in Washington state's laws as it applies to Boeing that have helped show the EU that we are operating in good faith. And so I do hope that that is the one that can be resolved. Again, I'm not going to say in short order, but hopefully, assuming we're still able to do all this stuff, notwithstanding coronavirus, I do think that this one probably has the best chance of having some sort of resolution over the summer. Steel and aluminum is one that I know it matters a lot to the UK. I'll speak very frankly here and say I'm very frustrated that we have steel tariffs on the UK. I argued against it when I was in the White House. I don't think it's the right move, but that is an issue that the president feels very strongly about. I think it's going to be difficult in the short term. I hope, though, at some point, that can be resolved between us. Because really, when it comes down to it, the steel problem's a China problem. It's not a UK problem. And hopefully we can find a way to fix it. I'm less optimistic in the short term, but hopefully we can also get there.
Thanks, Cleet. And just to say, we may run 1 or 2 minutes over 5 o'clock, but we will look to end this as close to on time as we can. But we just wanted to get to a few more questions from audience participation. One, Barbara, in your experience at USTR, the UK and US, obviously, 1 million Brits work in the US. US firms over in the UK employ 1 million Brits, and likewise UK firms in the US employ 1 million Brits. And one of the questions we've had coming in, and I'm interested based on your USTR experience, whether visas and talent, labor mobility will be something which will look to be addressed in a UK-US trade agreement, or does that not usually fall within the remit of a trade agreement?
The answer is absolutely no. They used to be part of trade agreements, and they are part of the services agreements that are negotiated globally, but the USTR has no authority now to negotiate what we call temporary entry in trade agreements. It may be possible that in parallel, the two governments could decide to do something in some other form, but not as part of the trade agreement. And can I just take the opportunity while I'm talking to add my point of view of what businesses can do to help give some momentum to the negotiations and things that were learned from TPP and TTIP. And that is that I think, along with what Marianne said about the narrative and giving momentum, and Cleet about the positive things that the business community can contribute, and ideas that they have about offensive interests that they have. I think one of the problems that we saw in TTIP and TPP was that the business community was waiting for the perfect agreement to emerge. So the perfect became the enemy of the good. And the opponents of the agreements were very, very vocal in what they saw was wrong with the agreement all along. But the business community refused to come forward in support of those agreements, even as they were still under negotiation, to talk about the benefits both to them as companies, to the economies generally, and to the relationship overall, until they saw the specific thing that they wanted concluded in the way they wanted it concluded. And by the time that happened, the opponents already had complete control of the narrative. So I think one of the things that's important is that even as companies are behind the scenes consulting with their governments about what they want to see as an outcome of the negotiation, they don't lose sight of the fact that they need to continue to talk about the value of the negotiation and the importance of the relationship.
Thank you. It almost sounds like you've been reading some BAB policy papers, because that's something we've said on a number of occasions in the past few years. Let's not let perfect be enemy of the good. So we're going to have one more question, and this one comes in for Lou, and then I'm going to give our participants the opportunity, our panelists the opportunity to give their final remarks. Lou, we've had one more question come in here from Paul, which says, in a three-way trade deal with the EU, what does a Democrat-EU relationship look like? And does that in any way benefit the UK? This is a hypothetical.
I think a Democrat-EU relationship, my sense would be stronger than the current relationship with the EU. For whatever reason, our current president clearly feels some level of animosity toward the EU. He does not feel toward the UK. He feels very fond of the UK, but he doesn't like the EU. And I think he sees the EU as a body that was set up to compete with the United States. I think a Democratic president would probably be a little bit more open to reviving previous Democratic administrations of trade talks with the EU in more of a comprehensive manner. So yeah, again, it's sort of hypothetical, but my sense is that a Democratic administration would be friendlier to the EU.
Okay, well, what we're going to do, and thanks to everyone for submitting their questions. We answered as many as I could do with one eye on the screen and one eye on the panelists. Before we bring a conversation to a close, just want to offer our panelists the floor for a concluding remark. If they want to summarize their thoughts or offer a personal thought or prediction on how they see the UK-US FTA going forward and what we can be doing to keep momentum. So I'll bring you in. Marianne, do you want to take the first bite of that one?
I mean, I think what we've very much seen from this discussion today, but also, you know, in general, is that the case for a US-UK free trade agreement is strong, politically speaking, economically speaking, strategically speaking. But at the same time, I really urge that there is a sense of realism of what is achievable and also when. And I think, again, the COVID-19 pandemic has added more complexity to already complex negotiations. But at the same time, again, it's an opportunity to also address some other larger trade issues. And again, with the UK outside of the EU as an independent trade nation, so traditional, you know, pro-free trade voice, this is a great opportunity. And then finally, specifically on the bilateral relationship, even though for now it's being ruled out that, you know, negotiations might proceed in stages, you know, I think that there could still be kind of incentive to have a more symbolic deal in the short term, again, given the complexities that were already factored in, but also in light of COVID-19 and, you know, the timeline of what is, again, achievable.
Thanks. Lou, do you want to give that one a crack?
Sure. Thanks again for organizing this, by the way. And just one thing, I want to echo Cleet's remarks about the business community really trying to weigh in. I think there is such a tendency in the UK, and the press here, the media really plays into it to focus on things like chlorinated chicken, as opposed to the many really positive things that could come out of a trade agreement. So again, just to reiterate his call for the business community to be very vocal about what they see as positives. The other thing to keep in mind is we haven't mentioned Congress in an hour here. And Congress, of course, will play a very big role moving a trade deal. And there you know, 50 senators and 535 congressmen and women who will all be very interested in what this trade agreement looks like. So again, encourage the British side to keep an eye, not just on the administration and the folks at USTR and the White House, but to do, I would start now with outreach to congressional districts and key congressional leaders to make sure they understand where the British side is coming from.
Thanks. Cleet, on the mention of Congress, I'll bring you in for your final thoughts on UK-US trade agreement going forward.
Look, I would just reiterate what I said before, and I think a lot of the other speakers echo it, which is just get out there. Let's create a positive narrative together. This can be a great opportunity for both of our countries. And, you know, let's not spend all our time talking about the NHS and chlorinated chicken. Although I do love every time my friends from the UK visit, you know, going out and having chicken and being like, hey, it tastes all right, right? You know, that's not so bad. No one's really complained about it. And my last point on a serious note, I do wish your Prime Minister well. I hope that he recovers swiftly from this illness, and that he's back up in full speed and concluding a deal with our president before we know it.
Yeah, we appreciate that. Thank you for those comments. And the update today was stable and positive. So hopefully we will have the Prime Minister back in action to lead our government in this time of crisis. Barbara, I want to offer you the final word on your thoughts on prospects for this UK-US trade agreement going forward and what we can do to keep some momentum.
my advice is that everybody just remain optimistic about the possibility that this agreement will come together, even despite the challenges and even despite COVID-19 and what that may do to the timetable. The press will relentlessly focus on the negatives and the challenges. Everyone knows what those challenges are, but negotiators understand the process and they will go through step by step to get there, as long as there's the support from the business community and from the political establishment for the importance of the relationship. So everybody just needs to keep their eye on the ball and understand that there is no problem that two countries that decide they want to get the agreement done can't figure out.
Well, thank you, Barbara. And I think that summarizes BAB's thought on the process very nicely. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you four, especially for being with us today and sharing your expertise, and to our over 100 participants for joining in. I know we didn't get a chance to get to every question, but I would encourage people to stay close to BAB as we go through this process. And we'll be bringing up more programming, which will cover many of the areas that we touched upon today. So on behalf of British American Business in both the UK and the United States, I would like to say thanks again to our expert panelists for their insightful remarks, and thank everyone who took the time to join today's discussion. Thank you.